Welcome to Revive Ministries Podcast. This month is March, and I think about a lot of things. Actually, my birthday month, for those who don't know, but also the fact that it's the changing of seasons, and I always like to have different themes. This month, we have talked about finding our why. I mean, it's so ambiguous when we think about what our why may be. I mentioned sharing this story about being next to a 7-year-old in a car ride, and he keeps asking, how long will it be and why? And a lot of times that curiosity dies as we grow older. But I think the curiosity of what is our why and why, finding our why, especially when you're struggling or you're going through rough times, or life events, or illness, or whatever your obstacle may be. I know that sometimes just having a purpose can be a very could be a big step forward. Today, we have a new guest. His name is Shane Thrapp. Am I saying that right? Okay.
Yep. Great job.
Thank you so much for coming on. I want to share before we start and as we continue to talk, a disclaimer: if you are in crisis in the States, 988 is our suicide crisis lifeline. But wherever you are in the world, I would encourage you to find what community resources they are, and find the people that you could ask a question or say, "I need help." As adults, it gets harder. It's not ever really easy when we're struggling, but there's sometimes it's harder for us to ask that question. Thank you again for coming on and just being a part of this conversation.
I'm happy to be here, brother.
A lot of times earlier this month, I've been using Mark Twain. I felt like I should throw this in there, even though it's part of my monologue that I kind of skipped over. The two important days in life are the day you're born and the day you discover a reason why. I think, however one takes that, I think purpose can be very, I said I think it was last week when I did my own version by myself on this topic. It was a story about a person who sees three people digging a ditch, and then it's how they look at that process. One's like, I'm just digging a ditch. The second person, I'm digging a ditch for water for a building next door that we're building, and the other one's saying we're building a cathedral. And it's kind of interesting how even though they're doing the same thing, they see it differently. So again, I just want to mention that real quick. Anything of this quote, since I have it up there, anything that speaks to you or anything you want to share, or as we get started? People say better than me, I always say.
I think when I see things like that, it really highlights the parts of my lives where I found the multiple whys, right? Mm-hmm. Because for me, there's never been just one.
Yeah. And
for a lot of people, we get stuck in this, I'm a man, that's my why. I'm supposed to be this way because I'm a man. I'm supposed to be a good father. I'm supposed to be all of these expectations that we start settling on ourselves. Mm-hmm. And sometimes in the midst of doing that, we forget about the other things about ourselves that makes us who we are. Our values, our strengths, our mindsets. We kind of stop thinking about those things because life starts weighing down on us so much. Mm-hmm. And as men, we are often told part of our why is to be the strength that holds up the mountains.
Yeah.
And it doesn't give us a lot of space to struggle.
Yeah.
Or to heal from struggling.
Yeah. I when you mentioned that, it reminds me of just, you're right. There's just not enough room when we make it such a broad, objective viewpoint. Okay, my why is to be a provider and the strength for my family, but there's no all our context of who we are, how we were brought up, what happened to us, goes thrown out the window, and we have to go through this generic. This is what the model for what why is for a man who's trying to provide for his family. It can be very heavy, especially when life doesn't really work out the way you would expect it. So,
right.
Yeah. So part of that is when you we identify ourselves, like you mentioned, like from our job. Like you could be like, this is my identity. That is who I am. But like you said it very well, it's not more than that. It's not just your job. It's the people you know, your job has a part of you, but you're also just you. And that's just is not justifying what it means to be saying that, if that makes sense. So I just want to get started on this kind of train of thought. I remember mentioned earlier this month, Picasso, the meaning of life is to find your gift, purpose of life is give it away. It's kind of this, it's you don't hide it, you don't squander it kind of thing. But at the same time, I do find there's some thread of wisdom, but it's not going to be one why or all the whys. It may be some whys that maybe this may present well for. When you hear this, anything that comes to mind for you or anything that you want to share?
I think that's one of the things that so many of my clients often don't learn early enough.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to work with people over the age of 35 who are dealing with ADHD or autism and ADHD dual diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, one of the biggest recurring themes that I see are people who are mad and angry because why didn't I learn about this earlier?
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't I learn about what to look for where I could use my strengths or I could use my gifts?
Mm-hmm.
And they look back at their life, and there's a lot of grief.
Yeah.
I mean, and that can cause a lot of people to kind of really spiral out of control. It's one of the reasons why we see a higher rate of suicide in people with ADHD and autism, because at some point we get to a place where we don't have any answers.
Mm-hmm.
And if we've let ourselves spiral into that really dark place after discovering that we could have had those answers,
Mm-hmm.
if people in our lives had taken the time to teach us how to learn from failure, teach us how to learn from our mistakes, celebrate learning from failure to make it not necessarily a good thing, because sometimes it's really crappy to fail.
Mm-hmm.
But every opportunity that I've ever had came from failure.
Yeah.
Because I failed in all these different jobs, I started discovering I wanted to be a project manager with the ability to go from job to job in my control.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was on drugs and dealing with a lot of issues with my mental health, that's how I found my first wife. And we wound up having 2 amazing children.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Even the divorce from her and the abuse that I discovered allowed me to learn to be more authentically who I was. And this is even before the ADHD and autism diagnosis, to find my current wife, who is my rock, who is the person who has pulled me out of debilitating illness and encouraged me and always supported me. And even when I sat here and said, hey, I'm going to revamp my business and pull Creating Order from Chaos back out of the mothballs and relaunch it, And it's just every time I have failed since I started learning about the need for learning from the failure, learning from the mistake has almost always worked out for me in some way or shape, form, or fashion.
Yeah, and I think about sometimes at least when I started experiencing my mental health issues, I remember coming back from the military and being very bitter. Being a bit bitter because I was there during I was work. I came back. I went to the military 18, came out at 21 or so. 9/11 Ray happened. I was during the 9/11 thing, and I was just remember going to a support group. Someone said to me, "I'm like this. I can't relate to anyone." I was bitter. Like these people had access to care. I didn't because I didn't know I didn't call it mental health at that time. In the military, I was just like I can't sleep well. I'm not sleeping enough. This is why this is all happening to me. And I just remember I was bitter for many years, and that did not help me. the pushback didn't help me, because later on I found that what I was pushing against was what I needed. Because now I work in the mental health field. I love it. I love what I do. I work with people, uh, and I see it differently. It's the same canvas, it's the same picture. It's just looked at differently. And I think a lot of times it was just the lack of insight. Culturally, it's different. Mental health catches up differently for culture. I'm half South Korean, half Puerto Rican. It's like no one could tell me what was going on with me, and I didn't understand what was going on with me. So there was a lot of shame, guilt, grief. What could I have been? Like I had a high aptitude. I remember going to recruiter's office, did the test. I was 90% out. They're like, you're not going to anywhere but Air Force. So I'm like, okay, I'll go Air Force. But the thing is, it didn't matter. All those titles, all those things, although at the end of the day, I wasn't taking care of myself. And it kind of crept up back on me. And I feel that was because I refused to fail. I refused to fail. And to the point where I had no life made the choice for me, and I had to take care of myself. So it does get frustrating thinking back, but I think forgiveness was the key for me, not only for myself, but the people around me. They did the best they could. No one knew. No one's a mental health counselor, psychologist, everything all at once. And even then, they're too close to it to even be effective. So it's just being kinder. And that took years of therapy and just to get back. But, I think, I just like what you said there, and it remind me of that. So I want to mention this one other quote. I think it was, I like this one because it talks about resilience, and it's kind of what we're kind of paralleling with. I like what she says, Yasmin Mogahed. She says, resilience is very different than being numb. Resilience means you experience, you feel, you fail, you hurt, you fail. No, you fall, but you keep going. It's not, I thought when I was a kid, I used to say, desensitize the sensitivities. I thought that was a way to go to kind of make it through life, and it kind of backfired for me. Any thoughts when you see this?
Yeah, it's really. Give me one second. Let me cough.
That's okay.
It's really relevant when we think about people with ADHD and autism.
Mm-hmm.
By the age of 12,
mm-hmm.
most people with ADHD or autism or other types of neurodivergence have heard 20,000 more negative criticisms than their neurotypical counterparts.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't you do it right? Why aren't you trying harder?
Mm-hmm.
You're the dumbest smart kid I've ever met. You constantly fail. You're a burden. Why are you so hard to parent? Why can't you do it right? Why aren't you like your friends? Why aren't you like your brother? Why aren't you like your sister? All those negative criticisms. And what a lot of people don't realize is because of the way that how our brains process things and the way that ADHD affects our self-awareness, we often build our image of self-awareness by the factor of external input that we are given.
Yeah.
Neurotypical people tend to have their own ability to and metacognition to be able to recognize, I am this person. I am, this, kind of, this is what I enjoy. This is the thing I do. They're able to build these building blocks of who they are from their personality a lot more on their own. And of course, environment still does affect them, but not at the same level that it affects people with ADHD and autism. Because we don't have that inherent self-awareness, we have to take the input of what people are giving us. So a lot of times when I'm working with my parents and helping them understand it, it's like, you've got to really watch the language that you're using around your children. You can't use the language of your parents and your grandparents, because that's part of the problem of why if you have ADHD or autism, which is a likelihood because it's largely hereditary and genetic, you can't use that same language because they're going to build themselves out of what you say. And if you're just giving them a lot of negative feedback without any lessons learned, or if you're sitting here turning, to using exercise as a punishment, or if you're sitting here using corporal punishment and you're spanking them, you're affecting them more, because the other side of the coin is emotional dysregulation in our system that experiences and processes the world.
Mhm.
And when you do those things, we feel things more.
Mhm.
But we also have memory issues. We have working memory issues, short-term memory issues. So it's very difficult for a child with ADHD to recognize that they are being punished for the thing that they just did.
Mhm.
All they really remember is that something happened, daddy hit me.
Mhm.
Something happened, mommy spanked me. Something happened, grandma screamed at me.
Mhm.
And by the time that happens,
Mhm.
all they can focus on is the betrayal of the person or people in their lives who are supposed to care for them.
Yeah.
And that instills a significant amount of trauma, up to about 3 to 4 times more likely for kind of PTSD and complex PTSD in those children. And that's the other thing that people with kids or adults with ADHD, we experience trauma at a higher rate because of how we process the world. And it's easier for us to experience trauma because we don't have your regular linear timeline of memories. A, B, C, past, present, future, right? This happened, then this happened, then this happened. We have trigger-based memories. So that when we experience a certain thing or a certain sound or a certain smell or sense, we aren't here anymore. We are where the trauma is.
I see.
Now, if that sounds familiar to you as somebody who's been in the military, we inherently have a closer system to PTSD almost naturally. Because we grow up significantly impacted by trauma for a large portion of our lives up to our 12-year-old, or even further.
And it's very interesting you mentioned all this because working in the field, I work with adults, and a lot of times the mental health, but there's not much insight of what the difference is. When you talk about mental health being like depression, bipolar, but then when it comes, I see in the diagnosis, just as an example, like I see ADHD, Asperger's, autism, but nothing ever is done. There's lack of insight. The parents just say, "Oh, it's just all one thing," and it's not. A lot of times, they won't be effective in therapy because they can't. It's depending on the various degrees, but I just feel that's a big gap, and I was very, when I was thinking about this episode, us talking together, I was gonna ask you to get more insight on it. Also, for those listening, and because unfortunately there are huge chasms of gaps of what people know and don't know when it comes to these kind of topics. But I just want to say thank you again for coming on and expressing this, because a lot of times it gets overlooked, and that's what this podcast tries to do. I'd like to give you an opportunity to give you now, since it kind of segue in that way. Could you share what brought you to? You share a little bit, whatever you're comfortable with, and a little bit more about like I was saying, autism, your ADHD, and anything that you think will be helpful for those listening, and anything that you learned along the way working with these people.
I never knew I had ADHD or autism until I was in my mid 30s. I was just always the weird kid. Ironically enough, my dad used the "you're the dumbest smart kid I've ever met" because I was hyperlexic. I can read extremely fast. And there's all these little circumstances about where I grew up in rural Northeast Texas. The nearest Walmart was 75 miles away. If that tells you about how far in the boonies I was at. And it was really odd because my dad self-medicated with alcohol and he was abusive. And I don't mean in a good old boy spank the child. I mean, legitimately, chronically abusive, both to me and my mother. Especially when he was drinking. And that's the environment I grew up in. And looking back, it's so confusing for me. And it stayed confusing for me. Some of the hallmarks of ADHD, when people think about it, is the classical, really hyper white kid in the class who's just bouncing all over the place. But the thing is there's multiple presentations of ADHD. There's a large number of different symptoms that all kind of fit into the ADHD umbrella, very similar to autism. And there's a lot of crossover with ADHD and autism. 40 to 60% of people with ADHD are likely going to have a large number of autism symptoms. And that gets really confusing really fast. And throughout my life, I've always wanted to know things. I love learning. I've always been had a joy for learning. And that was my biggest struggle in school, because I learned too fast. I would get very bored very quickly because the teachers only taught from the books. And I was hyperlexic, so I was reading the textbooks. And by the time the teacher would get to that place, I already knew it. There was no challenge. The teachers didn't go outside of the book. They didn't really try to do anything. And even whenever I got into AP classes, that were college level, I was still, because they kept memorization of the book. Cool, I've got you. I don't have working memory, but I have long-term memory that's based on triggers. So if you're going to give me a pop quiz and it asks me a question, I'm going to be able to go back and reread the part of the book in my brain, because I also think in words. I don't think in visual. I don't think in spatial or anything like that. I specifically think in words. And it's that kind of stuff that's always separated me from the other people who were around me who were neurotypical. And it was complicated. I also didn't recognize social cues, which led to a lot of embarrassment, led to a lot of really awkward conversations with girls. And it wasn't until I was 12 that I found a system that would work for me. And this is kind of one of those things that really shows you the capabilities of our minds when we need to adapt to learn things if we're given the tools to learn them. And in my case, it was watching Oprah and hearing about an FBI expert talking about body language expertise. Like, here's a quantifiable thing. I can see this facial tick do this thing, and that tells me what they're thinking. Except children don't have the same facial things as adults, which led to some more complications and things like that. But I did a lot better. I got a lot more of the jokes. I understood a lot more about the human psyche, and that was it. That was the start of my journey. I was so interested in the human mind. Now, I didn't ever pursue that though, because by the time I got out of high school, I lost all that structure in my life of high school, of the home, of having parents who supported me and helped me, even though it was a horrible home situation. And when I lost all that, I felt lost. And I had been, in the church, but the problem with that is I was actually raised in a cult, a Southern Pentecostal cult. And so I wasn't able to find anywhere that wasn't almost always linked back to trauma.
Yeah.
And, after a while, I started finding project management. And the more that I found project management, the more that I started putting in place tools in my life, accidentally, that helped me manage things more effectively with ADHD. And then, of course, after my first marriage dissolved, I really started going, who am I? And I started looking for my why. And that was it. That was the key point in my life where I said, I want to help people. I love managing projects. I love doing these different things. I know that I'm going to, I need to bounce from job to job. And, so instead of looking at that as some sort of weakness, how can I make this a value? How can I make this a strength? And that's when I found short-term contract project management. And so I became a that kind of position and started going from company to company, but on my terms, not theirs. Instead of getting fired, I was going, deuces, had fun, I'm out. Y'all got it. And that really turned things around for me, and it really started to help me grow. And then, of course, I met my wife, and she was really a huge part of that because she accepted me for who I was. And each one of these lessons are things that I've carried through to how I parent, to how I work with other people. And it's almost always where I start with my clients. Who are you? Right? What are your values? What has built you up? And this is also the same thing that we need to be doing for our children as parents. A lot of times what I'm coaching them to do is, let's figure out your children's strengths. Let's figure out their weaknesses. Let's figure out how they can manage their weaknesses through their strengths. Let's see what kind of external tools do they need. And the biggest thing is what we need to understand, and you mentioned this earlier, is an understanding of the mental health issues that your child deals with. Right? You should not just be like, oh, my child has ADHD. I'll just give them medicine. There's so much more to it than that. Medicine is just a part of the process, right? You also need to be making sure that you're teaching them how to learn the way they learn. You need to be teaching the teachers. This is how my child learns. This is what they need. Please do not do these things. Please do not do these things. If you cannot not do these things, then you should absolutely inform me, and I will work with them on the thing instead of you working with them on the thing. Right? You need to be their rock and their foundation. And you've got to cut down on that negativity, because so much of what our children with ADHD and autism deal with is out of their control. As an autistic person, I can't control the fact that I have food sensitivities, clothing sensitivities, light sensitivities. I cannot control those things. I cannot control. As an adult, I can't control that I live with those things. I, however, can use non-fluorescent lights. I, however, can wear clothing that makes me feel better. I, however, can not eat the foods that I don't want to eat. Right? But children don't have that. Most often, whenever adults with children have this, their children and are dealing with these different things, the children aren't able to communicate that the food is disgusting, or, without doing something that's going to irritate the parent. They can't process that. Why is my skin so itchy? They don't know that it's their clothing that's making them itch, because it's some sort of synthetic fibers, or they have an allergy to cotton or something like that. They can't control that they can't read the words because they may have dyslexia as a comorbidity, or they can't control their feelings because they have alexithymia, where they can't quantify the feeling. They don't understand happiness and sadness as two separate things in an objective viewpoint. And so we see a lot of that whenever you sit here and show a child with autism, this is a child with smiling. Are they happy or are they sad? And the child will I don't know. Because they can't recognize it. The processing of their brain doesn't work that way. This doesn't make them stupid. They just process the world differently. And often they are behind their peers in some way with it across the executive functions and social functions and stuff like that. And that means that they are often babied or abused, either or of the extremes. And they're not given the tools, and the parents don't know to meet them where they're at, and the teachers don't know to meet them where they're at. Instead, they're held to these social standards or educational standards that are too far beyond them or too far behind them. it's just so much about what I work with people on is psychoeducation on ADHD and autism and the comorbidities, and really working with parents and entrepreneurs to develop a better understanding of who they are and who their children are and how to find their way through lives as they discover these new things about themselves.
Yeah, I was thinking while you're mentioning is like those who are listening, their things present differently. Like I was always told I was on high functioning whatever diagnosis. Like I was, and that presents in depression. High functioning depressive person is a very different thing. Okay, than a person who with major depression that is non-high function. It's not, doesn't mean I'm better. It just it presents differently. I have to be careful of how I go about it. And I would say, it's like what you're mentioning. I feel is frustrating sometimes with mental health. It's more we're talking about mental illness, not mental health or ADHD. The whole problem I have is like going to a doctor and they tell me everything that's wrong with me and how I got this wrong with me, and then the appointment's over. There's no steps forward. It's like this is the etymology of what happened with you, and then that's it. So a lot of times it's kind of this is just how life is now, and there's no curiosity of how finding ways, just like you're describing, to navigate through in your life solely based on what works for you and trial and error, and as you're mentioning in that way.
Yeah. The thing is we also have expectations of doctors that don't fit what they actually do.
Yeah.
Right. We have the idea that we're going to go to a doctor and they're going to be able to tell us the how and the why of what's going on with us. Right. And in some cases, many doctors do their best to do so. Obviously, there's some doctors out there who don't. Right. But when we're coming into the mental health area there's a lot of doctors out there that are very ignorant. And a doctor's role is to diagnose and prescribe medication and treatment. That's it. They don't want to hear your emotional whatever it is. They don't want to hear about your meltdowns. They don't want to hear about your child's food issues. That's not their job. That job falls into the realm of therapists. Therapists are who we need to be going to figure out the why and the how. Yeah. Because they're going to be the ones who know how to delve into and identify and really pull out those things from us through conversation and treatment. But a lot of doctors don't give you that guidance. Now, that's getting better nowadays. But, 10, 15 years ago, that wasn't their job. The nurse practitioner is going to be the person who's going to send you off to, a referral or whatever. But their job is to diagnose and medicate and give treatment. That's it. Now we're starting to understand that treatment needs to include therapy. It needs to include parent training. But we don't have enough resources that are doing parent training. That's where coaches like myself step in. Right? I'm one of the groups that I run, the ADHD parent support group and the autism parent support group. We've got about 14,000 members in those. Most of what I'm doing is education on what these are, what parents need to expect, and how to adjust their expectations to meet their child where they're at. Because these parents are reading books like What to Expect When You're Expecting and other books like that are really just kind of like very generic, neurotypical status quo where your child should be. But like I said earlier, children with ADHD and autism are often going to be further ahead or further behind than their neurotypical counterparts across the board in various things.
Yeah.
But
parents
are expecting parents are expecting their children to adhere to this status quo. And they're pushing those expectations on the children, and the children are powerless to meet those expectations in a lot of cases, which is what leads to the trauma and the pain and the frustration and the blowouts and the anger and the bedwetting and the sleep issues and the food issues and the exercise issues. And that's what leads to all of it, is because of our expectations as parents are not meeting where the child is at. It's forcing the child to fit into a box that they don't fit into.
Yeah. And I find that a lot of times, because I'm on the other side of the spectrum, working in the mental health outpatient, that it's people will come as adults with autism, with all I'm looking at their while I'm intaking them. I'm like, do you see a behaviorist? Do you see anyone for, you know, do you want a behavioral therapist? It's different, okay, because I'm helping them. But they're like, no, no. A lot of times the parents have very limited insight of what that even means. They're like, well, you know, this should all take it as like one stop shop. This should all take care of everything, and it really doesn't. And unfortunately, um, therapists, mental health therapists, can go so far with what they can do when it comes to someone with certain aspects or severity of autism, ADHD that they can't really help with in that regards. So
Yeah, and that's another place where coaches step in.
yeah,
A lot of times, what I spend a majority of the time, like I said earlier, is the psychoeducation, but the big component is the moving forward.
yeah,
Right? Because people with ADHD often get really lost in the minutia, and autistic people also get really lost in the minutia. They need a person who kind of like says, okay, cool, that's an excellent thing. Let's focus back over here and let's start moving forward in this direction. All right, cool, great job. Let's celebrate the progress. They need to be taught how to celebrate progress.
yeah,
and adjust their expectations, because so many of my clients come in here and they expect this diagonal line to go straight up improvement, right? All right, this is where I'm at, this is where I want to be, straight line. But that straight line isn't a straight line. It's this diagonal that has all these jags in it. Sometimes those jags go really low, they go below where you were, but then they jag straight up. And like that's the kind of line that we're going to be seeing. And I have to adjust people's expectations, because those people learn their expectations from their parents who had unrealistic expectations of them. A lot of men that I meet have these expectations that are placed upon them by society and by their spouses and by their families of who they're supposed to be. And they go through their life trying to meet that. And along the way, this kind of goes to what you were saying earlier, there really isn't high functioning or low functioning or things of that nature. We've started really seeing a lot more understanding in the research that what a lot of people are calling high functioning means high masking. They're able to mask and meet a large chunk of it. But what we also see in those people are higher rates of suicide and suicidal ideation, higher rates of burnout, higher rates of further mental health degradation, relapses into addiction, relapses into sexual deviation and other stuff like that. And I don't mean sexual deviation by like BDSM or porn or anything like that, but I mean like targeting children and stuff along those lines. That's where we see those people who are high functioning or high masking or masking. That's where we see the struggles eventually hit, because what a lot of people don't understand is burnout is the broken bone of the mind. It is a severe injury, a catastrophic injury of the mind. And because we're masking so many of our symptoms, we're overloading our brains constantly. And it's the same thing as if you keep breaking your leg over and over again, or keep trying to walk on a broken leg. The damage becomes worse and worse and worse. And as it gets worse and worse and worse, we keep trying to manage. We keep trying to live up to these standards. We keep trying to live up to these expectations, and we destroy ourselves for it. That's why people with ADHD and autism have 13 fewer years on their lifespan than their average neurotypical.
It's interesting. Obviously, when I mentioned high functioning in my own experiences, it was a difficult, just how it presented for me. I had a more difficult time, I would say, environment, culturally, being half South Korean. And also what was interesting that I learned was I used to try to explain things while I was going through with family. And you know how close that came through having a semblance of, I guess, the understanding, almost like never. It was like not like I tried, but then I focused on my treatment. I focused on the people who were helping me. I didn't need to require them to understand to support me. It was an insight that was weird at first to accept, that they didn't need to understand every aspect that I was going through, especially during the hard times. However, I was also accountable and responsible of going to get the care and relating that to the people that can help me. Everyone has their own job, but these are years of insight that took a while and a lot of failures to get there. So you're right in the sense, when I was saying high function, I would say I could look like I'm doing awesome and present very well that I'm doing awesome, manage a lot of things that the status quo would say, oh, he's doing fine, but I wasn't, and that was the biggest thing. So
yeah, and that's where a lot of people come to our men's ADHD support group. It's another group I run on Facebook of 20K members. A lot of these men come in here and they're like, I just found out I have ADHD, and they're in their upper 30s and 40s. And it was like nobody recognized it in me. Nobody recognized that I was dealing with ADHD. And that's because ADHD, this is one of those really confusing aspects of ADHD, because we know that there's a large genetic and hereditary component to ADHD. There are genes, and there are different presentations that can be seen from parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, twin studies. We've seen it across the board. And they sit here and they are really confused because they're like, and they had a really supportive family, and the parents got it, and they were like, yeah, I was totally cool in school, and I didn't have any problems, and my mom and dad were great, and they were awesome. And then they got out of school, and they lost the structure, they lost the support. They wound up in college with less accommodations. They wound up in the workplace with bosses who don't understand it, don't get it, don't care. They just want you to get the job done. And that's when the ADHD really actually starts to kick in for them. And that's where they start to see their symptoms, because we now know that trauma and environment can exacerbate latent ADHD symptoms and autism symptoms, and they can present as an adult with no childhood record of it. And of course, they go to the doctor and they say, hey, I think I have ADHD. In my case, I went to the doctor and said, I think I have ADHD. And they're like, well, did you have anything like this when you were a child? And I said, no, I was never diagnosed as a child. Oh, well, that's a childhood disorder. No, it's not. It's a lifetime disorder. And it is an issue that we deal with as people. And the biggest thing that I wish and I hope people can take away from this, calling it a disorder is a misnomer. It's not. It's just a different way of processing. Yes, we struggle because we struggle in a world that doesn't get it and doesn't care. We struggle in a world that doesn't take the time to teach us in the way that we can learn at the level that we're at the time, and then work with us to grow up, to develop that foundation that can move us forward. We were talking about resilience earlier. This is one of those reasons why people with ADHD are so resilient. Our brains, when we have ADHD, we thrive in environments like the military, police departments, EMTs, emergency room doctors, high-end sales developers, like high pressure corporate work. We thrive in that while we have that. And if we are in that environment and we have the support that we need and the accommodations that we need and the tools that we need, then we can be very successful. But all too often we find ourselves working to try to make money to survive, and we don't have time or the tools to be able to identify what we need. And so that's where a lot of my work comes into, working with corporate companies to develop those things for them and to work with their employees who have it and develop systems for them. And then working with the entrepreneurs, which is a big passion of mine, to help them develop the business, because they think going into a business for themselves means they have to do all the work. And we can't do that. None of the biggest CEOs or the corporate executives or anything like that do the work by themselves. All of them have a personal assistant or a virtual assistant. All of them have managers who manage the day-to-day stuff. All of them have admins or coders or analysts who are giving them the data so that they can process it in the way that their brain functions and works. But people at socioeconomic levels like you and I probably grew up in, we don't have those resources and tools. It has to be up to the parents to provide those resources and tools to the best of their ability. But the biggest resource that they should be giving their children is love and acceptance.
Yeah, it reminds me, and obviously, I had this several times happen to me. I'm going to get to our final thoughts. But before, I want to share. Sometimes a parent will come in, just as an example, point, and they'll be like, "My son or daughter's." He's not doing this. I'm like, leave. I tell the parent to leave a lot of times because I need to talk to the person. So my client. I talk to the client, and then if the client agrees, I talk to the parent after. And the parent, I'm like, and then I find out, yeah, the kid is not doing this. But I said the last thing I want this kid to feel is that he can't come back to me. They can't come through the door because you put these expectations so high. The fact of the matter is, I've seen a lot of. I literally have to tell clients, don't tell me what you think I want to hear. Tell me what's really happening, and building that trust, because I feel a lot of times when even when a parent, I'll just say this feels so devastated, maybe they made a mistake for a son or daughter who's struggling with ADHD or mental health or whatever. That person sees it and they say to themselves, I cannot fail because of what I've just saw. And then they don't say everything that is really going on with them. So it's not always like, oh, I'm being negative, but also how you present and expectations, not only for them, but for yourself, because they see it, at least from my experience. So.
I mean, we also have to recognize that some of those parents are people with ADHD and autism themselves. It's never been diagnosed or treated.
True.
And their emotional dysregulation is bouncing off of the child's emotional dysregulation.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you're the adult. You're the one with the life experience. You're the one that has to step up here. And you have to do what it takes to be able to help your child. And that means being able to help yourself and get the treatment and the support that you need. And identifying it and learning about it, that's the biggest step that so many parents fail at. It's how I learned because my oldest son was diagnosed with autism and ADHD when he was 8. That's what got me into it. I was like, what is this? And I knew his mom wasn't going to do anything about mental health. So I had to step in and be the person who would learn about mental health. And that's where the journey started for me.
And, I think I try to think about in math and trig, when you go to the derivative of any huge, you go to the simplest form. And a lot of times what comes to mind when it comes to mental health is person's name. Who is it? Who is that person to me? Because that's what matters. Sometimes we're not equipped to know these things just by chance. We're not going to remember them or know them not ever being exposed to it. So I really agree, and I'm totally in line with that. If you want to know more, the people matter to you. Learn more, find out more, increase your knowledge. Final thoughts. It's been really great to have you on and sharing so much information and insight. Anything you want to share? Final thoughts when you think about finding your why. I know we go, what would you like to tell parents, those people who may be struggling, those people who may be not knowing if they have ADHD, or just anything about that we talked about?
I think a lot of people need to get away from the mindset that our children and we are required to meet social expectations when it comes to a lot of this stuff. And cultural expectations, like you said earlier, there's a lot of very old-fashioned mindsets that come around these social and cultural expectations that we really need to reevaluate. Just like we have reevaluated our laws and our legal systems and developed understandings of psychology and psychiatry and really started developing understandings of physical and mental health, we really need to take the time to understand that mental health is just as important as physical health.
Yeah.
And just like you go to a doctor to get diagnosed for, back issues or broken bones or things of that nature, you need to be going to the doctor and talking to them about your mental health and really getting evaluated for it. And if you've got children who have ADHD and autism, there's a really high likelihood that somebody, either you or your husband or both, and more than likely some of the other children, are going to have different or have variations of that themselves. And you need to also understand that they may present differently. We know that ADHD presents differently in girls than it does boys, largely. Now, obviously, can a girl have hyperactivity and be bouncing off the walls? Absolutely. Can a boy be, daydreaming and really lost in his thoughts, like inattentive ADHD? Yes, absolutely. That's what I have, is inattentive ADHD. But what we have to grasp as a whole, honestly, as a nation, is that mental health is just as important as physical health and should be checked on regularly.
Yes, I'm totally for that. I think we gotta stop. At least for me, I think we gotta stop just viewing as mental health as a mental illness. I want to emphasize the health part. That means that there's something you can do. It's like, like I said before, whether it's a doctor or a treatment team, if they only told you what was wrong with you and nothing about what you could do, it's pretty discouraging. So.
Also, I'll tell you, like I tell all my ADHD parents and autism parents, don't be afraid of medication. I mean, yes, some children deal with side effects, but track that with your doctor and find the combination that works for you. The things that we know that treat ADHD are medication, exercise, and acceptance and parent training. Right? Those are the things that treat ADHD. Supplements don't treat ADHD. Diets don't treat ADHD. It doesn't. Medications, exercise, therapy, support, love, parent training. All of it's required.
I just want to say thank you, Shane, for coming on and sharing so much. I just want to also say to those listening, to find out more on this, just check out the notes, and also I want to also say, each month we're doing a new theme, but I just want to appreciate each one of you who are listening and all my guests. And I want to say, just check out the ReviveMinistryFL.com website for any updates. We're on YouTube, we're on Instagram. That's about it for now when it comes to media platforms. But I just want to say thank you so much, Shane. Just taking your time.
I really appreciate it. Yeah, had a blast.
This is goodbye from Revive Ministries Podcast, leaving the last quotes from Henry David Thoreau. He says, "What you get by achieving your goals is not as important as what you become by achieving